What does it mean to be an American? I would like to believe an American is someone who can make a difference in our nation, who sets an example for those around them to follow. It is also someone who is a leader and can follow our nation's civic values. These values are courage, initiative, honor, justice, moderation, perseverance, respect, responsibility, resourcefulness, and vigilance. If someone can live by these values, they are definitely someone worthy of being called an American. In our history, many great people have represented a great number of these values. In fact, it would be difficult to limit each person to only one. Instead, it would be easier to choose one of the values and decide which people in history showed a great deal of that specific one. Though all these values are important to forming a great American, I do not believe any of them would be possible without courage. Courage is what a person needs in order to initiate anything. Courage is what pushes people to do things. Once that has happened, then honor, justice, respect, and the rest of the civic values can be earned subsequently. Over the course of this school year, we have discussed many honorable people, whether they were leaders of the land or mere slaves. The few men I chose have been remarkable examples of the civic value, courage. The first was George Washington. Known to most as the father of our country, he was the word courage in the form of a man. It must have taken an unthinkable amount of courage to be such a figure of our nation. From leading his troops in battle to being the first president of the United States, only one of the bravest men could take on such a task. Many do not recognize him for his courage, but that was a trait most deserving. December 26, 1776, Washington fought one of his most famous battles, the Battle of Trenton. After his famous cross of the Delaware River, Washington personally led the middle charge. He fearlessly brought his troops to Trenton, where they battled with the Hessians and had an unbelievable victory. Without his intelligence, bravery, and persistence, the American troops would not have won. Washington had skills on the battlefield that no one else had. Even though he and his troops were exhausted, he pushed on and led them to victory. This example of courage was memorable. It was courageous of him to lead the middle charge where he would be the biggest target, and courageous of him to press on even when things became tough. Another time George Washington represented the civic value was when he was inaugurated as the very first president of the United States. I've read the article, The Inauguration of George Washington, 1789, and in it talked about the whole inauguration process of George Washington. From what I read, it seemed as though the nation saw Washington as being cowardly and awkward throughout the ceremony. Washington himself even wrote in his diary, "About 10 o'clock I bade adieu to Mount Vernon, to private life, and to domestic felicity, and with a mind oppressed with more anxious and painful sensations than I have words to express, set out for New York in company with Mr. Thompson and Colonel Humphreys, with the best dispositions to render service to my country in obedience to its call, but with less hope of answering its expectations." In this quote, we see how nervous Washington was about his inauguration, but that does not make him a coward. In fact, this is probably the largest display of courage he had ever shown. Anyone would be nervous to become the leader of one of the most powerful nations, let alone the first. Washington went through with the inauguration and ended up being one of the best presidents of all time. Of course he was nervous on the day of and leading up to the ceremony. This was only because he wanted to make sure he met everyone's expectations, and he was the best leader he could be. This event was a huge display of courage on Washington's part, for not only following through with becoming the first president, but also by being a great first leader of our nation. Another man from our history that was true to the civic value of courage was a man named Dred Scott. He was not quite as popular as George Washington had been, for he was an African-American slave, someone who was not even considered to be a person in his time period, let alone respected. However, this poor soul's voice was heard at one point during his life when he stood up for himself and questioned his slavery. The story goes like this. Dred Scott was a slave to an army surgeon who traveled often for work. When the surgeon was called to duty in Illinois, he brought his slave along with him. It wasn't until years after their return and the death of Dred Scott's owner did he realize that Illinois was a slave-free state. He He brought his situation up to the Supreme Court to argue that because he lived in a free state for a period of time, that he should be granted freedom from slavery. This story shows courage in so many ways. Being in the lowest social class, it was nearly impossible for his voice to be heard. Especially being a slave, Dred Scott faced potential punishment or death for even attempting to speak up. It was so courageous of him to voice his opinion about something most slaves would have avoided or held inside. Eventually, Dred Scott earned his freedom, but if it were not for his courageousness, he would never have gotten out of slavery. At a turning point in our country's history, we are introduced to a couple of men who are always spoken about as if they are one. These courageous men were Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. Appointed to lead one of the most memorable expeditions of all time, President Thomas Jefferson knew these men were perfect for the job. They were to travel across the country all the way to the Pacific Ocean to explore the unknowns of the western side of the United States. These men showed enormous amounts of bravery for their work. Not anyone can build up the courage to blindly walk into something like this. These men truly had no idea what they were going to face, and the fact that the trip was so successful is incredible. Along the way, Lewis and Clark had to lead men and ask for hospitality from complete strangers that were different from anyone they had ever known. That alone is something not any man would be able to do. This strength and bravery certainly earns them a spot on the list of most courageous men of all time. The final man I will be discussing is yet another courageous soul. Growing up in a poor family, John D. Rockefeller had very little. He made a living off selling candy to classmates and later becoming a bookmaker. After becoming bored of his life, Rockefeller decides to risk it all. This is the first stroke of courage and fearlessness he shows throughout his eventful life. He decides to invest all of his money into oil refining. He believes refining oil into kerosene would soon become a huge market. After near bankruptcy with his oil company, Rockefeller thought all hope was lost. However, he did not give up hope. His grit kept him going strong and keeping faith in his business. Soon enough, all of his hard work proved to be worth the struggle. Rockefeller's kerosene soon became a highly valued item on the market. Rockefeller was successful, but nothing compares to where he went next. He was a somewhat small and independent businessman, and it was a stable and safe way to go. However, Rockefeller was not the one to be satisfied with average. As scary and intimidating as it may have been, Rockefeller decided he wanted to collaborate with one of the most powerful men in the world, Cornelius Vanderbilt. He promised Vanderbilt that he would deliver an incredible amount of oil to be shipped on his trains. Though this was a dangerous situation, it paid off in the end. Rockefeller soon became one of the wealthiest men in the world himself. Rockefeller's story is not only a story of success, but it is a story of strength, valor, and courage. He took risks in his life that could have ended horribly wrong, but without those risks, he wouldn't have gotten to where he did. Rockefeller is the purest example of courage because he came so far and even collaborated with one of the most powerful businessmen in the world. It takes true fearlessness to do such a thing, and Rockefeller was more than successful. Throughout our history, we have seen a diverse array of men and women who are the ideal definition of what it means to be an American. The few men we looked at today are only a small selection of people who stood out from the past. Though all these people have represented aspects of all of the civic values, here we saw how they all strongly connected to one specific trait, courage. In order to demonstrate courage, we had to see these men step out of their comfort zones and defy social norms. These men have gone above and beyond average, and that is what makes them stand out so starkly. These inspiring men are the people that set an example. They are people that our nation should look up to for their bravery and the changes they have made in our world. These men are leaders, and our nation should be proud to call them Americans.